Much to Adrian for the invitation to speak today. The Charles Work Group certainly provided a lot of support to Outsell in our research, and so we're grateful to support this conference seminar as well. I'm glad to see that my picture is up there, just in case you were curious which one is Laura Ricci. There she is. Okay, so to begin, again, we'll be talking about just sort of a high-level market picture of China. So there's really three pieces of context that I hope we take from this. The first piece of context is really to rehash some of what Adrian just shared about why China. What are some of the factors that are going into the growth in the Chinese market, and particularly the growth in the scientific publishing market in China? The second piece of context is then how big is the market? I'll be looking at it in terms of sales and revenue, but we do understand that this is only one piece of the puzzle. A complementary look will be provided later by David, which is more of a look at the that will be more of a look at the scientific output coming from China. So this part will be looking at providing some context for how big China is in terms of its sales potential. And lastly, the third piece of context will be what is the market made of? What are its component parts? And what are some of the challenges and key drivers that are taking us forward in this market? So I'll begin with showing what is a fairly familiar graph. This is China's growth in GDP from 1991 through 2011. And you can see that it's increased from 8 to 14% each year since 2000. This is fairly familiar to many because of just because the growth has been so large, and Goldman Sachs lumped China in with several emerging economies and called them the BRICS. So these are the economies which have the growth potential and the demographic potential to become major economies going through the 21st century. Second graph, this is the proportion of spending on research and development of GDP. So you can see that back in 1997, they were only spending about 0.5% of their GDP on research and development. That has increased year on year, so that now they're spending about 1.8% of GDP on research and development spending. And this is a leading indicator for scientific output, scientific publishing. To put that in context, the OECD average for GERD, or gross domestic product spent on research and development, is about 2.4%. And the United States spends about 2.9% of its GDP on research and development spending. So for that reason, China has pledged to increase its proportion of GDP on research and development spending to as much as 2.5% by 2020. So what that looks like in practice is this. This is the spending on research and development in real terms. Now, the reason I didn't jump directly to this graph is because I wanted to really highlight the two factors which are playing into having this sort of beautiful northern curve here. It's not just that China is growing economically. It's also that it's increasing its investment and its attention to scientific output, to increasing its presence in the scientific community around the world. And so while this tells one story, you can see that our research and development spending increased more than double that of its GDP. So this really speaks to the amount of targeted investment and the amount of concentration that's happening in science in China. So what does this mean for scientific publishers? We took a look, as Adrian mentioned, at the Chinese market and wanted to paint a picture of how big it was in terms of revenue, to provide some context for publishers approaching the market so that they knew what to expect. The first thing that we wanted to look at was how big it was in terms of the buyer profile. Obviously, it's a large demographic market, but what does this mean? How many institutions are there? What's the actionable size of the market? So the Charles Worth Group was kind enough to provide some data on this. They pointed out a couple of different statistics. So first, the Chinese Ministry of Education identified 8,791 higher education institutions in 2009. Put that in some context, the National Center for Education Statistics in the United States identified about 4,470. So predictably, China being a much larger country demographically, it has a larger number of higher education institutions. The National Natural Science Foundation of China identified 2,464 academic education and research institutions, which are qualified and registered to apply for central government research funding. And the Ringgold database, which identifies potential purchasers of content, identified 4,840 unique records for content on mainland China, 2,205 of which are parent level. So these are some pretty large numbers, obviously, and so this, on the surface, looks very exciting. But when you drill down, you see that actually the actionable size of the market reflects the fact that the Chinese government is really focusing much of its investment to a select tier of universities. And so the market, which really has a strong budget for purchasing content, particularly scientific content, and supporting this research, is much smaller. So some of the government initiatives which we'd like to draw attention to are, for instance, Project 211. This is a group of 113 universities. So out of that 8,700 number, really only 113 universities contain 80% of doctoral students, 66% of graduate students, 50% of the students studying from abroad, and 33% of undergraduates. And the key data we saw was that they utilize 70% of scientific research funding. So this is quite a top tier. Related to this, Project 985 is an even smaller tier. These are 39 universities which are tasked with becoming amongst the best in China. Amongst these, 10 are tasked with becoming world-class, and 2 are tasked with being amongst the best in the world. So this is a second example of very targeted investment. And amongst the hospital market, the hospitals are categorized in 3 different tiers, further categorized into classes A, B, and C. Of the 2,000 plus hospitals in China, there are only 2 which achieve 3 peak status, which means they are the largest and they have strong budgets for content spending and so on. And only 900 are 3A, which also puts them in that top tier. And I'm also told that amongst those 900 hospitals, really only 200 support English language content. So really, the actionable market needs to be put in context in this way, that even though it's large, there's really some specific areas of targeted investment. So Outsell did the math, and we've estimated that the Chinese market for STM content was worth $1.12 billion in 2011. That was a growth of 10% over 2010. What this encompasses is that within the global scientific, technical, and medical content industry, excluding our geophysical data segment, so representing core content, this is slightly more than 5%. However, the STM market in China outgrew the rest of the content industry by more than double. So the global content industry only grew by 3.8%. We see this growth continuing on through the next 3 or 4 years, so that by 2014, it will have grown on average between 10 and 12%, and it should be worth about $1.53 billion at that time. This is in some ways a sign of the market's maturation. So in the past, off of a smaller base, it may have achieved greater growth levels. However, we think that this 10 to 12% is more sustainable. And as you can see, it will grow at well above the rate of the global average. So its CAGR will be about 10.5%, whereas the core content industry as a whole will be about 4.2%. So there are, as I mentioned, its growth is slowing somewhat, so it is maturing. However, there are still many aspects of the industry where we feel there continues to be further opportunity, and there remain to be some unmet needs. So I'll briefly go through these growth drivers through 2014, and then I'm sure during the course of the panel we'll be getting much more into detail. But this is, again, just to paint a layer of context. Well, wrong direction. So the first, journals and databases and analytics. This is fairly straightforward. Journals are a very important content purchase in the Chinese market. Databases and analytics, we call these out because of the importance to the Chinese researcher of quantifying the impact of research and being able to identify what is the most relevant research. This is something that we see as a key driver in this market, and that will feed growth going forward. Digital, along the same lines. This is, of course, important everywhere in the STM content industry, but we do find that the Chinese market supports digital publishing. Its infrastructure is there amongst this top tier of universities. And especially we also see that there are researchers coming in from overseas that are being incentivized to return to China and continue their scientific output creation within China's borders. And so that is driving the need or the desire, I should say, for digital content, and it is being supported going forward. Along the same token, as these researchers both begin to move back into China, and also as Chinese research begins to be disseminated around the world, Chinese as a business language is growing in importance as well. So content which is in English is being accepted into China. Content is being translated depending on its use, and Chinese content is also growing in importance outside of China's borders. So this is something I'm sure we'll be touching on throughout the day as well. As I mentioned, the government has targeted its investment on research and development. There are certain fields which are receiving new attention. So, for instance, agricultural technologies. This is a country of over 1 billion people, and the technology to feed these people sustainably is very important. So that received a 53% increase in funding in this year's government research budget. Basic sciences likewise received a similar jolt. Right now, the fundamental sciences only receive about 2 or 3% of all research funding, and that's increasing to as much as 15 to 16%, which is in line with more developed economies. On average, fundamental sciences encompass about 15 to 16%. China is now hoping to increase their spending on that to match that proportion. And lastly, industrial and corporate. If you think about it, made in China is very important. China is now the biggest consumer of automobiles, and one anecdotal example here is that the Beijing Institute of Technology Press, which is associated with a top automotive manufacturing institution, their growth in their publishing operations has been 30% year on year. So it goes to show that as China's manufacturing and infrastructure needs increase, then that will support a strong market for technical content and so on. So that's how we support our assertion that the market will continue to grow in following years. There are still areas where the market is not yet saturated, and there is a lot of opportunity going forward. So the other thing to put the market in context, however, is that despite this high growth, we see the market as being, it will encompass between 6 and 7% of the global content industry in 2014. By the same token, we estimated that the U.S. encompassed about 44%. So to keep it in context, this is a fast-growing market. However, it's growing off of a smaller base, and so there's still a lot of room for it to develop, and there's still a lot of opportunity going forward. So the last piece of context I hope to share is a little bit about what the market's made of. It's not one homogeneous market. There are different moving pieces and different challenges that we see operating for each. So the easiest way to do this conceptually is to break the market into international and domestic publishers. And this is fairly straightforward, but we did this for a second reason as well, and that is the General Administration of Press and Publication, which is the regulatory body which works with the publishing industry. And that body has a different relationship with each of this category of publishers. So for the international publishers, it regulates the international publishers' access to the market, and there are some intermediation that needs to happen there. And for domestic publishers, the GAP in many ways guides their actions and guides them with overall industry initiatives. So that's the basis for our segmentation of the market, and we think it holds just because of the different challenges that each segment can see. We estimated that in terms of revenue, the international publishers received 63% of the market by revenue, which is about $700 million, and domestic publishers attained 37%. Now, we estimated this again, in terms of revenue, international publishers amongst these top-tier universities achieve a high proportion of those budgets, and they're able to achieve higher pricing, higher value for their content. In many cases, domestic publishers are more strongly positioned to price to market and are able to achieve higher volume sales, especially to the second and third tier universities, where international content spending is in many ways a luxury purchase. So this was our estimate for the market, and there are a number of different factors which play into how this designation was reached. So for international publishers, some of the key challenges, which again we'll be discussing throughout the day. As I mentioned, pricing is a concern for many international publishers, particularly those which have been in the market for some time. Legacy pricing is a very difficult thing to shake off, especially as when entering the market, content was priced well below the world level. As the research spending has increased, it becomes harder to increase the pricing in line. We hear that in many ways newer entrants to the market have less of a challenge achieving adequate value for the content, but this is certainly something that publishers are looking at. Piracy is also a consideration. The Alliance for the Protection of Copyright of Foreign Publishers is a group of international publishers which are working together in China right now to try to advocate for better intellectual property controls and educate the market about the importance of paying for content. And they have made some headway. For instance, they confronted an eBay-like website which was selling sign-on passwords to Springer Link and Science Direct for about $30 each. So they confronted this website, and actually the website agreed to self-monitor and to of its own initiative, stop its users from selling these passwords. So that is a hopeful sign. It's certainly a sign that it's beginning to be taken more seriously. And there's a lot of work to do, and it continues to be a challenge, but it's something that international publishers are taking on going forward. The last challenge is half a challenge and half an opportunity, really. It's the indirect routes to market. This is a product, again, of regulation, and so there are a lot of different intermediaries that are worked with when working with the Chinese market. It's not allowed to publish directly into the Chinese market, but it can be done through joint ventures and partnerships, and different sales can be made through different intermediaries. However, it's still, despite these challenges, it's still possible for international publishers to command high value, and there's work being done to increase the value that can be gotten out of this market so that its growth going forward and its strong position now can be withstood. I have here a couple of illustrative examples, which are certainly not comprehensive, but I wanted to pull these out to tell you what I mean by intermediaries. So the first two intermediaries I mentioned here, the DRAA and the NSTL, these are library consortia, and one of the key differences between the two is publishers negotiate with each of these to sell content into China. For the DRAA, which is part of the Ministry of Education, the content is not purchased by the DRAA, but the prices are negotiated. So they certainly have a stake in maintaining fairly low prices for their users. For the NSTL, the content is funded. However, to sell to the NSTL, the content needs to be hosted within China in a dark archive, which is something that some publishers don't feel comfortable doing for various reasons. So if the content is not hosted within China, one of the options that publishers can take advantage of to get their content into the country is through the China Education and Research Network, which is also run by the Ministry of Education. And they, in this case, the university user normally has to pay a surcharge to access the content which is hosted outside of the country. The publisher will bear the cost of that and essentially lease a line so that their content can be visible in the Chinese market, and that this surcharge will be eliminated. And the last intermediary, which is pretty key, is the CNP-IEC and the CEP-IEC. And these are book distributors, or book import-export agents. And they historically have had pretty complete control over print distribution. And I would call out specifically the CNP-IEC at this point because they've also recently had an agreement with Publishing Technology to create a new digital gateway, which is a digital import-export platform. And that was just launched during the London Book Fair, so details are still pending, but they're anticipating that there will be as many as 1 million pieces of content on this platform within a year. And we think it poses a pretty strong opportunity for both publishers outside of China to get their content in and publishers within China to get their content out. So along that thought, some of the challenges for domestic publishers. As I mentioned, for international publishers to sell into the Chinese market, they need a domestic partner. The domestic publishers, along the same token, to distribute internationally, many times they will draw on partnerships with international publishers and get the content out to the global market in that way. So in terms of their own infrastructure and their own capabilities, there is in some cases less infrastructure there to support that global distribution. And so on the whole, that sort of feeds into the attainment of lower impact factors as well, because without that global distribution, the impact factor is many times more difficult to achieve. And this is something which I'm sure we'll get into. The impact factor is very important for the health of content in the Chinese industry. It's certainly a key driver for many content purchases. So the most immediate challenge in the short term, however, is that many of these domestic publishers, they're able to price better to market. Historically, it was because they operated as not-for-profit enterprises. So they would receive government subsidy and they would receive support as a key industry. However, following 2010, most domestic publishers, with the exception of 5 large conglomerates, were made fiscally independent. So that transition ended in 2010, and these publishers now must operate as for-profit businesses, which is a bit of a challenge if you consider what their historic infrastructure and business model has been. So in the short term, this is certainly a challenge for them. The GAP is also supporting the publishing industry by encouraging them to not to remain insular, but to increase their capability to communicate with the rest of the world, and the term is to go global. So these are 2 key initiatives from the GAP, which are both challenges and opportunities for domestic publishers. Our estimates for the domestic market really predicate on the strength of, as I mentioned, the 5 conglomerates which continue to be government subsidized and which receive continuing support from the government. So our estimates show that the 2 large commercial publishers, which the imprints are Science Press and Higher Education Press, and they are part of the China Science Publishing Group and the China Education Publishing and Media Group, respectively. These are their STM revenues, and so we estimate that they encompass almost half the market, and the remaining 451 publishers between them have the remaining half. So for these smaller publishers, which are now trying to develop their own businesses to attain adequate profits, there will be a struggle in the short term. But for these large publishers, they're being strongly positioned to grow, to go global, and to strengthen the health of the Chinese domestic publishing industry on the whole. To put this in context one more time, this is the original graph I showed you, which shows the size of the STM content industry at 21.01 billion, the size of the industry in China, which is 1.12 billion, and then the size of the domestic publisher share of the market. So what I want to highlight with this slide is that it's really a growth game. So there is a lot of work to be done here, and what the government, what their initiatives usually take the form of is 5- and 10-year plans. And so it's wise for publishers who are approaching this market to think in similar increments. This sort of growth and this strength in communicating more with the world will not happen overnight, and it's not expected to happen overnight. So there are many opportunities to be met here, and it really takes a lot of long-term vision and long-term planning to support the industry as it grows. Because the key essential action that we've determined from all of this is really that partnerships are the key to the Chinese market. There are different challenges being seen by both international publishers and domestic publishers, and really they can best be met if the two work together. So it's very much a market of give and take. As I mentioned, these partnerships are helpful to expand the content, both to expand the market for content coming into China and to expand the market for the Chinese content to be distributed outside of China. And also this is helpful to share market knowledge about what's going on both within and without the country. The corollary to this is that as this communication increases, the quality of the scientific output in China will be raised as the high-quality content from outside comes in, but also the high-quality research which is being done in China. If you remember all of the investments that the Chinese government is funneling towards improved science, that has to go somewhere. So sharing that content worldwide will help to strengthen the quality of science globally. So that is my picture of the market in terms of sales. I think this is a great point to transition to David's slides, which are going to be a discussion of what this looks like in terms of the content coming out of China. So thank you very much.
And thank you, Laura, for a sort of really excellent summary. And we are going to sort of drill down into different aspects of what Laura was talking about in some of the other presentations.